On November 27, 1945, Lieutenant Commander John Rowley stood on the deck of the Royal Navy destroyer HMS Onslow. The war in Europe had been over for 6 months. Japan had surrendered 3 months ago. The killing was supposed to be finished. But Rowley was watching something that made him deeply uneasy. 2 miles ahead of him, a German U-boat was being towed toward the Irish Sea. U-2326, a Type 23 coastal submarine. She was one of 116 U-boats that had surrendered to the Allies in May 1945. And now the Royal Navy had a problem. What do you do with 116 of the most advanced submarines ever built? You cannot keep them. The Treaty of Versailles and the Potsdam Agreement forbid it. You cannot give them to the Soviets. Stalin would reverse engineer them and build hundreds more. You cannot let them rot in harbor. The technology is too valuable, too dangerous. So the Allies made a decision. They would sink every single one. Operation Deadlight. 18 months. 116 U-boats, all deliberately destroyed in the deep waters west of Ireland. It was supposed to be simple. Routine target practice for the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force. But on this grey November afternoon, something went terribly wrong. Lieutenant Commander Rowley watched through his binoculars as the tow line to U-2326 suddenly went slack. The submarine was drifting. He did not know it yet, but inside that U-boat, seawater was flooding into the battery compartment. Salt water and battery acid were mixing, creating chlorine gas. The gas was building pressure. Lots of pressure. Rowley raised his binoculars again. Something seemed wrong with the submarine. She was riding lower in the water, listing to port. Then U-2326 exploded. The blast was massive. A column of water and steel shot 200 feet into the air. The submarine disintegrated. Pieces of her hull rained down across a half-mile radius. The shockwave hit HMS Onslow like a physical blow. Rowley was thrown to the deck. Windows shattered. Equipment tore loose. When he scrambled to his feet and looked around, he saw something that made his blood run cold. HMS Onslow was taking on water. The explosion had opened seams in her hull. She was sinking. All around him, sailors were screaming, running, trying to launch life rafts. The destroyer went down in less than 8 minutes. 32 British sailors died that day. November 27, 1945. 6 months after Victory in Europe Day. They were the last combat casualties of World War II in European waters, killed by a German submarine after the war had ended. This is the story of Operation Deadlight, the massive secret operation to destroy Hitler's U-boat fleet. The advanced technology the Allies were terrified the Soviets would capture, and the U-boat that became a killer even after Germany surrendered. It is one of the most bizarre and forgotten chapters of World War II, an 18-month campaign to sink an entire navy, and the tragic irony of sailors dying in peacetime from a weapon that should have been harmless. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Kriegsmarine received a direct order from Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. All U-boats were to surface immediately, hoist a black flag, sail to designated Allied ports, and surrender. It was called Operation Regenbogen, Rainbow. For the U-boat crews, this was the end of a nightmare. They had fought for 6 years in the most dangerous branch of the German military. 75% of U-boat crewmen had died during the war. 3 out of every 4 men who went to sea in a U-boat never came home. The survivors were exhausted, traumatized. Many were teenagers who had been drafted in the final desperate years. When the surrender order came, most U-boat commanders obeyed immediately. They were relieved the war was over, relieved they had survived, but not all of them obeyed. Some U-boat captains refused to surrender. They scuttled their boats, opened the seacocks and sent them to the bottom rather than hand them over to the enemy. Others tried to escape. A handful of U-boats fled to Argentina and Japan. Their crews became refugees, stateless men living in exile. But most obeyed, and between May 8th and June 4th, 1945, 156 German U-boats sailed into Allied ports and surrendered. It was an incredible sight. Long lines of grey submarines, each flying a black flag of surrender, their crews standing on deck with their hands visible. No weapons. They surrendered at Loch Erebol in Scotland, at Lisahalli in Northern Ireland, at Wilhelmshaven and Trondheim. The Allied naval officers who received them were shocked by what they saw. Many of these submarines were brand new, advanced designs the Allies had never encountered in combat. Type 21 and Type 23 electroboats, submarines that could stay submerged for days, that could outrun destroyers underwater. These were not the old Type 7 boats that had terrorized the Atlantic convoys. These were next-generation weapons, revolutionary designs. And the Allies immediately understood the danger. If the Soviet Union got their hands on these submarines, they could copy the technology, build their own advanced submarine fleet. The Cold War was already beginning. Stalin could not be allowed to have this technology. The problem was the Potsdam Agreement, the treaty that divided Germany after the war. It stated clearly that all German military equipment would be divided equally among the Allies. That meant the Soviets were legally entitled to their share of the U-boats. British Prime Minister Clement Attlee and US President Harry Truman were horrified by this prospect. They looked for loopholes in the treaty. They found one. The Potsdam Agreement said the military equipment would be divided, but it did not say the equipment had to be functional. The Allies could destroy the U-boats, then divide the wreckage equally. Technically, they would be following the treaty. The Soviets protested furiously. They knew exactly what the British and Americans were doing, but there was nothing they could do about it. The treaty language was clear. So, in November 1945, the Royal Navy launched Operation Deadlight. The mission was simple: tow the surrendered U-boats into the deep waters of the North Atlantic, sink them using naval gunfire, torpedoes, or aerial bombing, make sure they could never be salvaged. The operation was commanded by Vice Admiral Sir George Creasy. He selected a disposal area west of Ireland. The Marlin Deep, a trench where the ocean floor drops to over 1,000 meters. Any submarine sunk there would be impossible to recover. 116 U-boats were designated for destruction. The rest had already been divided among the Allies for technical evaluation, or had been scuttled by their own crews. The Royal Navy assembled a task force: destroyers, frigates, aircraft carriers, even battleships participated. For many Royal Navy sailors, this was personal. They had fought the U-boats for 6 years. They had watched friends die, ships torpedoed, convoys slaughtered. Now they would have their revenge. The first U-boat was sunk on November 27, 1945, U-2479, a Type 7C boat. She was towed 100 miles west of Northern Ireland. A Royal Navy frigate put 2 torpedoes into her hull. She sank in less than 3 minutes. The operation had begun. Over the next 18 months, the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force would sink U-boat after U-boat. They used the operation as live fire training. Giving crews practice with real targets, destroyers would practice gunnery, firing their 4.7-inch guns at the surfaced submarines. Watching the shells tear through the pressure hulls, torpedo boats would practice attacks. Launching Mark 8 torpedoes at point-blank range, RAF Coastal Command bombers would practice dive bombing, dropping depth charges and rockets on the helpless submarines. Some U-boats were used as targets for new weapons, experimental torpedoes, new types of depth charges, even early guided missiles. The German U-boat crews were forced to watch. Those who had been taken prisoner were held in camps in Scotland and Northern Ireland. They could see the ocean from their barbed wire enclosures. They could hear the explosions. They knew their boats were being destroyed. For many German submariners, this was worse than combat. These boats had been their homes, their protection. Some crews had served on the same U-boat for years. Now they watched them die one by one. A few German sailors kept journals. Their entries from late 1945 and early 1946 make painful reading. One U-boat engineer wrote, "Today they sank U-407. I served on her for 2 years. She kept us alive through 27 patrols. Now she is gone. Blown apart for target practice. It feels like murder." The British sailors conducting the operation had mixed feelings. Some enjoyed it. They saw it as justice. Payback for 6 years of convoy duty. For the merchant sailors who had frozen to death in the North Atlantic. For the warships torpedoed without warning. But others felt uneasy. These were not combat sinkings. These were executions. The U-boats were helpless, their crews already prisoners. Lieutenant James Welch of HMS Hesperus wrote in his diary, "We sank 3 U-boats today. It should feel like victory, but it just feels sad. The war is over. These boats are already defeated. Why do we keep killing them?" But the operation continued, week after week, month after month. By March 1946, 70 U-boats had been sunk. The Royal Navy was developing efficient procedures, standardized methods for towing, for bombing, for ensuring complete destruction. Some U-boats sank quickly. One torpedo and they were gone. Others were stubborn. Type 21 boats with double hulls that could absorb enormous damage. One Type 21 required 4 torpedoes, 200 shells, and 6 aerial rocket attacks before she finally went down. The most difficult boats to sink were the Type 14 supply submarines. Massive vessels designed to refuel other U-boats at sea. Their fuel tanks were subdivided into dozens of compartments. Even after being torpedoed, they would stay afloat for hours. One Type 14, U-488, refused to sink for 2 full days. The Royal Navy finally had to board her and open all her hatches manually, letting the ocean pour in until she finally went down. But the operation was working. The U-boats were being destroyed. The technology was being sent to the bottom where the Soviets could never reach it. Then came November 27th, and U-2326. U-2326 was a Type 23 coastal submarine, small, fast, designed for operations in shallow water near enemy coasts. She had been commissioned in January 1945. She had completed exactly 1 war patrol before Germany surrendered. She had fired no torpedoes, sunk no ships. She was brand new, almost undamaged. A perfect example of late-war German submarine technology. The Royal Navy had been studying her for months, taking measurements, photographing every detail. By November, they had learned everything they needed. Now it was time to destroy her. On November 27th, HMS Onslow began towing U-2326 toward the disposal area. The plan was simple. Tow her 120 miles offshore, put a torpedo into her, watch her sink. But nobody had properly inspected her interior before the tow began. U-2326 had been sitting in Leesahalle Harbour for 6 months. Her hatches had been open. Rain had been getting in. Seawater from high tides had splashed into her hull. The water had pooled in her battery compartment. German submarines used lead-acid batteries for underwater propulsion. Huge banks of batteries, filled with sulfuric acid. Seawater and sulfuric acid do not mix well. The chemical reaction produces hydrogen gas, and chlorine gas. Both are explosive. Both are deadly. As HMS Onslow towed U-2326 into deeper water, the submarine began to ride lower. She was flooding. Slowly. Steadily. More seawater was entering the battery compartment. More gas was being produced. Pressure was building into the sealed submarine. At 2:15 p.m., the tow line went slack. 326 was wallowing. Drifting. Lieutenant Commander Rowley ordered HMS Onslow to close the distance. He wanted to inspect the submarine, see what was wrong. At 2:23 p.m., U-2326 exploded. The blast was catastrophic. The entire forward section of the submarine disintegrated. The pressure hull, designed to withstand the crushing pressure of deep water, was torn apart from the inside. Shrapnel from the explosion peppered HMS Onslow, steel fragments traveling at supersonic speed. They punched through the destroyer's thin hull plating. They severed pipes, ruptured fuel tanks, opened seams below the waterline. HMS Onslow began taking on water immediately, flooding in 3 compartments. The pumps could not keep up. At 2:29 p.m., Captain Robert Sherbrooke gave the order to abandon ship. The crew launched life rafts. They jumped into the freezing November water. The Irish Sea in late November is 4 degrees Celsius. Hypothermia sets in within minutes. Rescue ships were already racing toward them. HMS Wrestler and HMS Zealous, both destroyers from the Operation Deadlight task force. They arrived within 20 minutes. They pulled survivors from the water, wrapped them in blankets, gave them hot tea. But 32 men never made it off HMS Onslow. Some were killed instantly by the explosion. Others were trapped below decks as the ship went down. A few died of hypothermia in the water before rescue arrived. The bodies of 18 sailors were never recovered. They went down with HMS Onslow. She lies on the bottom of the Irish Sea to this day. The Royal Navy immediately suspended Operation Deadlight. An investigation was launched. What had gone wrong? The inquiry concluded that U-2326 had not been properly inspected before towing. The flooded battery compartment had gone unnoticed. The chemical reaction had been inevitable. It was a tragic accident, but it was preventable. The Royal Navy implemented new safety procedures. All U-boats would be thoroughly inspected before towing. Battery compartments would be drained and ventilated. Tow lines would be longer. Escort ships would keep greater distance. Operation Deadlight resumed in January 1946. By December 1946, 116 U-boats had been sunk. The last one, U-2508, went down on February 11th, 1947. The operation was complete. Hitler's U-boat fleet was gone. Resting on the bottom of the Atlantic, 1,000 meters down, unreachable. The irony of Operation Deadlight was not lost on anyone involved. For 6 years, the U-boats had been the terror of the Atlantic. They had sunk over 3,000 Allied ships, killed tens of thousands of merchant sailors and naval personnel. The Battle of the Atlantic had been the longest continuous campaign of World War II. From September 1939 to May 1945. 6 years of submarine warfare. At one point in early 1943, the U-boats were winning. They were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. Britain was weeks away from starvation. Then the tide turned. New technology, radar, sonar, long-range aircraft, escort carriers. The Enigma code broken. By mid-1944, the U-boats were being hunted to extinction. German submariners called it the second happy time, for the Allies, not for them. By May 1945, the U-boat fleet was a shadow of its former self. The crews were boys. The experienced captains were dead. The boats were obsolete. And then Operation Deadlight finished the job. The survivors were destroyed without firing a shot. But the legacy of those submarines lived on. The Type 21 boats that were sunk during Operation Deadlight represented a technological revolution. They were the first true submarines, designed to operate underwater for extended periods. Not just submersible torpedo boats. Several Type 21s were spared from Operation Deadlight. They were taken by the Americans, British, and French for technical evaluation. The American Navy studied them intensely. They influenced the design of the Tang-class submarines, the first modern American submarines. The Soviets, despite not getting any complete Type 21s, managed to get to the technical plans. Soviet intelligence had captured German naval architects. They forced them to recreate the designs. The result was the Whiskey-class submarine, essentially a Soviet copy of the Type 21. Over 200 were built. They became the backbone of the Soviet submarine fleet in the 1950s. So in a way, the Allies failed. The technology did reach the Soviets, just not in the form of actual submarines. The wrecks of the Operation Deadlight U-boats are still there, scattered across the ocean floor west of Ireland. 116 steel graves. Some have been located by sonar surveys. Others remain undiscovered. The ocean is deep. The wrecks are widely scattered. In 1997, British and Irish marine archaeologists surveyed the Malin Deep. They found multiple U-boat wrecks. Some had broken apart on impact with the ocean floor. Others were relatively intact. All were heavily corroded. Covered in marine growth, home to fish and crustaceans. The archaeologists noted that the wrecks are slowly deteriorating. Eventually they will collapse completely, returning to the iron and steel from which they were made. The site is not protected. It is not a war grave. The U-boats had no crews when they sank. They were already empty. But HMS Onslow is different. She is a war grave. 18 British sailors are still entombed inside her. Their families asked that the wreck be left undisturbed. The Royal Navy conducts occasional memorial services. Ships passing through the area will sometimes pause, lower their flags, drop a wreath, honoring the men who died after the war ended, killed by a weapon that was supposed to be harmless. Operation Deadlight is a strange footnote to World War II. It does not fit neatly into the narrative of Allied victory. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. But the killing continued. Not from combat, from bureaucracy and paranoia. The Allies were so terrified of Soviet naval power that they destroyed an entire fleet rather than risk Stalin getting his hands on a few submarines. And 32 British sailors paid the price, killed by a U-boat explosion 6 months after peace was declared. Today, almost nobody remembers Operation Deadlight. It was classified for decades. The full story did not emerge until the 1980s. Even now it is overshadowed by the more famous operations. D-Day, Market Garden, the Battle of the Bulge. But for the families of those 32 sailors, Operation Deadlight is not a footnote. It is a tragedy. Their loved ones survived the war. They should have come home. Instead, they died in a pointless accident, towing a submarine to its grave. The last combat casualties of World War II in European waters. November 27, 1945. HMS Onslow rests on the bottom of the Irish Sea. U-2326 is scattered in pieces around her, and 115 other U-boats lie in the deep water of the Malin Trench. Silent, forgotten. The ghosts of Hitler's submarine fleet. Operation Deadlight succeeded in its mission. The U-boats were destroyed. The Soviets did not get them. But it came with a cost. A cost measured in lives that should never have been lost. And that is the story nobody remembers. The 18-month campaign to sink a navy. and the submarine that became a killer even after the war ended.